we need a press that is doing its job, and it isn't. I mean, that is why, you know, we have the problem with the principal problem with democracy. There's two big failures. One is all the corporate money that's going into our election process. And the second failure is that we have a negligent and indolent press in this country that has simply let down American democracy. And you know, I travel all over the country and I hear people talking still, you know, people talking about the liberal media. Well, that's what Joseph Goebbels used to call the big lie. If you just keep saying it and saying it and saying it, people begin believing it. But there's no liberal media in this country. You know, what do you have? You have The Nation's magazine, you have Mother Jones, you have Rolling Stone, you have Pacifica Radio, Air America, and then, you know, you have these two guys, and that's pretty much it. But we have a right-wing media in this country, and if you look around, that's where Americans are disproportionately getting their news. And, you know, the Pew Foundation recently did a survey that showed that 30% of Americans now say their primary news source is talk radio, which is 90% controlled by the right. 22% said cable news, mainly Fox News. 10% said Sinclair Network, which is the most right-wing of all of them. Sinclair is the largest television network in our country. It's run by a former pornographer who requires all 75 of his local affiliate stations to take a pledge that they will not report critically about this president, or about the war in Iraq, or a number of other issues. And then the rest of us, only 11% of Americans now read papers, where you still can get some relevant news occasionally, but the rest of us get our news primarily from the traditional corporate-owned media, ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN, which have no ideology except for their own pocketbooks. And that ideology is almost always coterminous with the ideology of the party in power, but particularly the Republican Party. Because, you know, they want all these consolidations, they're supporting these corporate consolidations. These are huge companies that have all kinds of subsidiaries that are looking for licensing deals and consolidation, you know, concessions from the government, and they're not going to say something that offends them. And, you know, you look on network television, there's no liberal equivalent of John Stossel or Glenn Beck or Robert Novak or Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly or any of these other guys. You know, you've got Alan Combs, you know, and that's just, I gotta read this thing that Randy read today. I mean, this guy is, you know, this is like, that show is like, you know, it's the Harlem Globetrotters and he plays the Washington, you know, Generals. It's just, his whole job is to lose every argument. And he says, here's what he said when President Bush declared mission accomplished a year ago today. Now that the war in Iraq is all but over, shouldn't the people in Hollywood who oppose the president admit they were wrong? That's from our great, you know, liberal voice on the American media. So, you know, this devolution of the American press began in 1988 when Ronald Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine. We had a rule in this country that was passed in 1928 at the dawn of commercial radio, and that called the Fairness Doctrine. And that rule said that the airwaves belong to the public. The broadcasters can be licensed to use them, but only with the proviso that they use them to promote the public interest and to advance American democracy. There were 3 requirements under the Fairness Doctrine. Number 1, they had to air issues of public import. That's why there's a 6 o'clock news hour on the networks. Not because they wanted it, they wanted to put entertainment in that slot. The news departments traditionally were money losers. So they were forced to do that as part of the Fairness Doctrine. That's why the radio stations periodically update you on the news. It's part of the requirement under the original Fairness Doctrine that they're still, you know, doing as a tradition. On number 2, if they were going to give opinion, they had to tell both sides. You couldn't have had a Fox News under the Fairness Doctrine. You couldn't have had a Rush Limbaugh. You could have had Rush, you know, 4 hours a day, but then they would have had to put somebody else on, a countervailing voice, for the next 4 hours. You couldn't have Rush and his ditto heads for 24 hours a day on the same station. And Rush Limbaugh got started in 1988, the year that Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine. Number 3, they had to avoid corporate consolidation. Congress wanted to make sure that people in Kansas could get crop reports, that people in North Dakota could get tornado warnings, that people in the South could get country music, that you wouldn't have, you know, programming and content dictated by a couple of corporate epicenters in remote areas of the country. And that part of the Fairness Doctrine, incidentally, was strengthened in 1945, was fortified, because they saw what Congress saw, what Hitler had done in Europe and the other fascist governments had done, where they had allowed these corporate consolidations and they had given these contracts and special favors to the media, and they had co-opted the media and got them on their side. And so that anybody who criticized them was either muzzled or was branded as, as unpatriotic. And they said, we can't allow that to happen in this country. So they strengthened that part of the Fairness Doctrine. Today, Ronald Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine as a favor to the Christian right, which was already plotting the takeover of AM radio, and as a favor to the studio heads who had helped him get elected, who were plotting the takeover of all media. And today, as a result of that, there are 5 giant international or multinational corporations who control all 14,000, virtually all 14,000 radio stations in America, all 5,000 television stations, 80% of our newspapers, all of our billboards, and most of the large internet content providers. So there are 5 guys who are deciding what we hear as news and information. And the news departments have become corporate profit centers. They no longer have an obligation to promote the public interest. Their only obligation is to their shareholders. And they serve that obligation not by telling us the difficult issues that we need to understand, like, what happens when you privatize Social Security, and how did the pharmaceutical companies end up controlling Medicaid and Medicare, and what is global warming, and all of these issues, but rather by cutting costs. And guess what? Where do they cut costs? They cut costs by firing all of their investigative reporters. 80% of investigative reporters have lost their jobs over the past 15 years. The people who could connect the dots between the money that came from the corporate polluters to the White House, then the rollbacks that were engineered by the White House, and the children that you see, the asthmatic kids that you see in New York City and all over this country. Nobody's making those connections. Nobody's connecting the dots. So you see the asthmatic kid, and you're not saying the White House has something to do with that. The fact that in 19 states you can no longer safely eat any freshwater fish caught in the state because of mercury contamination coming from coal-burning power plants that were supposed to have removed 90% of that mercury 5 years ago, but the White House, having accepted $48 million from that industry, rolled back those rules so that now there are 19 states. All of the freshwater fish are unsafe to eat, and in 49 states, most or some of the freshwater fish, including New York, which most of them are unsafe to eat. The only state where all the freshwater fish are safe to eat is Wyoming, where the Republican-controlled legislature has refused to appropriate the money to test the fish. But in all the other states, some or most or all of them are unsafe to eat. According to CDC, 1 out of every 6 American women now has so much mercury in her womb, 1 out of every 6, that her children are at risk for a grim inventory of diseases: autism, blindness, mental retardation, heart, liver, and kidney disease. My levels of mercury are 2.5 times what EPA considers safe just from eating fish. And all of this could have been stopped except that Bush abolished the mercury rule. But but Americans don't know that. I go and buy my fishing license for $30 a year every year in New York State, and I get the fish advisories, which are now this thick, that basically say there's only a few places where you can safely fish in New York State. I read through that thing and I'm saying, that son of a bitch, George Bush. But most fishermen who buy that thing don't make the connection. The reason they don't make the connection is because there's no investigative reporters out there telling them about that connection.